In a small, quiet town, there lived a man named Marcus. He was a black man, but that was not the most important thing about him. To his neighbors, Marcus was just another friendly person, someone who worked hard and always had a smile for everyone. He was the kind of person who kept to himself, always polite, and never caused any trouble. Most people didn't know much about his life outside of the town. Marcus had a job that he kept a secret. He worked as an agent for the FBI. Every day, he helped solve important cases, sometimes risking his life for the safety of others. But the people around him had no idea about his true identity. Marcus had always believed in keeping his work private. To him, it was safer that way, both for his own safety and for the safety of his family. He was just another face in the crowd in the eyes of his neighbors. At home, Marcus lived alone in a simple house. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was peaceful, and it was his sanctuary after long, stressful days. He had grown used to living this way, keeping his personal life under wraps. But he had a few close friends who admired him for his strength and calm demeanor. They didn't know about his work either, but they did know that there was something special about Marcus. What made Marcus different from most was his strong sense of justice. He believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. He didn't care about the color of someone's skin, their background, or where they came from. For him, what mattered most was how a person treated others. He was proud of the work he did with the FBI, but he also knew the world was full of people who didn't share his values. Some people, especially in places like his town, had a hard time understanding how a black man could be part of a law enforcement agency. Yet Marcus continued his work quietly, not seeking fame or recognition. He wanted to make a difference without drawing attention to himself. As an agent, he had been involved in some tough cases, but nothing could have prepared him for the series of events that were about to unfold. The truth was, some people in his town were starting to notice him more than they should. And not everyone liked what they saw. While Marcus went about his everyday life, a group of local police officers began watching him. These officers, who secretly held racist views, grew suspicious of him. They didn't like the idea of a black man being a part of law enforcement, and they started to make plans. They didn't know it yet, but their hatred and jealousy would lead them down a dangerous path. They would soon make a terrible mistake, one that would change the lives of many people, including their own. But for now, Marcus remained unaware of the danger that was beginning to creep closer to him. He was just living his life, believing in the quiet strength that had always guided him. Little did he know, the peace he had fought so hard to maintain was about to be shattered in a way he could never have imagined. As Marcus continued with his life, doing his job with quiet dedication, a darker story was unfolding right in his own town. In the local police force, there was a small group of officers who felt deeply troubled by the fact that a black man worked for the FBI. They didn't understand how someone like Marcus could be part of law enforcement. To them, a black man could not possibly be trusted to do such an important job. These officers, who believed in outdated ideas of racism, secretly formed a bond over their shared hatred. They didn't like the idea that Marcus, a black man, was someone they had to answer to in the world of law enforcement. They were jealous, angry, and resentful, but they kept their feelings hidden behind smiles and fake politeness. Outwardly, they pretended to be professional, but inwardly, they were filled with suspicion and dislike. At first, their actions were subtle. They would whisper among themselves about Marcus, making remarks when he wasn't around. They talked about his calm demeanor and how he seemed to carry himself like someone who was better than the rest. To them, it felt like an insult. They started to make plans to put Marcus in a situation where he would be caught off guard, where he wouldn't be able to fight back. The officers, led by their senior member, Detective Carter, began to watch Marcus more closely. Every time they saw him driving to work or walking through town, they would make sure to note it down. They made a game out of tracking his movements, feeling some strange sense of power over him, even though Marcus had no idea they were doing it. Their jealousy grew stronger each day. They saw how well-liked Marcus was by the people around him, how respected he was in the community. They didn't understand why he was trusted, and in their minds, it was unfair. They wanted to prove that Marcus didn't deserve to be in the position he was in. They wanted to tear him down and make sure that no one would ever look at him the same way again. Soon, their plans grew darker. The officers began talking about going beyond simple spotting. They started to discuss how they could take action to ruin Marcus's life. It started as a joke, but soon, it became a plan, one that they believed would send a clear message. They didn't just want to embarrass him or make him look bad. They wanted to break him completely. They started to think about burning down his house. They figured that by destroying everything Marcus had worked for, they would finally show the world that a black man could never truly fit into the world of law enforcement. But even as they made these plans, the officers didn't think about the consequences. They didn't think about how far their actions would go or the ripple effect they would cause. In their minds, they were justified. They believed they were doing the right thing by destroying Marcus's life. They couldn't see how wrong and dangerous their actions truly were. As their plot started to take shape, Marcus remained completely unaware. He was still going about his daily life, doing his job, believing in the values of justice and fairness. He didn't know that there were people out there who hated him simply because of the color of his skin. He didn't know that there were those who would go to extreme lengths to try to ruin his life. Little did he know, the storm was about to come crashing down on him, and his life would never be the same again. The racist officers, led by Detective Carter, had finally made a decision. Their quiet whispers and secret meetings had turned into a concrete plan, one that they believed would change everything. They had convinced themselves that Marcus, the black man they saw as a threat, needed to be taken down. To them, he was the perfect target, and they were sure their actions would make their point clear to everyone. Detective Carter and the others sat together in a small, dimly lit room one evening. They had drawn up a detailed plan for how they would destroy Marcus's life. They were no longer talking about just spying on him or causing trouble at work. They had decided that they would go further. They would burn down his house. By doing so, they hoped to strip Marcus of everything he had worked for, to leave him with nothing but ashes. It was cruel, but they felt it was the only way to teach him a lesson. They knew Marcus's schedule. He worked long hours, often staying late into the evening, handling sensitive cases for the FBI. That meant he was rarely home at night. This would be the perfect time for the officers to act. They planned to wait until Marcus was out of town, working on one of his FBI assignments, before carrying out their attack. It was the perfect cover, they thought. There would be no one around to stop them. Over the next few days, they gathered the materials they would need. It wasn't difficult for them. They had access to everything they needed, and no one was watching them closely. They told themselves that they were doing the right thing. In their minds, they saw themselves as heroes, righting what they believed was a wrong. They were determined to go through with it, no matter what. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea what was coming. He was busy with his own work, completely unaware of the plans that were unfolding behind his back. He was focused on his mission for the FBI, always dedicated to doing what was right. Every day, he went about his business, trusting that his peaceful life would continue. But the officers were relentless. They wanted to make sure that no one would suspect them. They knew they had to be careful to make their actions look like an accident. They decided to set the fire in such a way that it would seem like a terrible mishap, something that could have happened to anyone. They even planned to leave behind a few clues to confuse the authorities, making it difficult for anyone to trace the fire back to them. The day of the attack arrived. Marcus was once again away on an FBI assignment, working hard to solve another case. He had no idea that, while he was out protecting the public, his own life was about to be destroyed. The officers made their move. They drove to his neighborhood late that night, quietly parking their vehicles at a distance. They worked quickly, knowing they had to get in and out without raising any suspicion. As they approached Marcus's house, They set the fire, watching in silence as the flames began to grow. They felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing they had finally gotten rid of the man they saw as an enemy. The fire quickly spread, and soon Marcus's house was engulfed in flames. They didn't wait around to see the damage they had caused. They left the scene as quickly as they had arrived, certain that their plan had worked. The next morning, Marcus would receive the terrible news. His house, the place he called home, was gone, destroyed by fire. Little did he know, the destruction of his life had only just begun. The officers, proud of their actions, would soon find out that they had made a terrible mistake. Marcus, far from being defeated, would rise to face what was coming. And they would soon learn just how wrong they were. The night was quiet, still, and cold. Most of the town was asleep, unaware of the dangerous actions unfolding just a few streets away. In the darkened neighborhood, Marcus's house stood silently, just as it had every night for years. It was peaceful, a place where he could rest after long hours of work. But tonight, everything would change. The group of racist officers, under the lead of Detective Carter, had already set their plan in motion. They had carefully chosen this night, knowing that Marcus would be away on an FBI assignment, working hard on a case far from home. They felt certain that they would get away with their cruel plot, believing no one would ever suspect them. With no one around to stop them, the officers moved toward Marcus's house. They didn't hesitate, knowing that their plan was almost complete. The fire, they believed, would be their final victory. It would destroy everything Marcus held dear: his home, his possessions, and his peaceful life. They were sure that once the fire was set, Marcus would never be able to recover from the loss. They had already placed the materials they needed around the house. With careful hands, they set the fire, making sure to use enough fuel to ensure the flames would spread quickly. As they watched from a distance, the fire began to catch. At first, it was just a small flicker, but it soon grew into a large flame, dancing in the night air. It spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. The officers stood quietly, watching the destruction unfold. They felt a sense of triumph, believing they had done something important, something that would make the town a better place in their eyes. To them, Marcus was a problem, and they thought this fire would solve it. They felt no regret as they stared at the growing inferno. It seemed like the perfect plan, a way to destroy Marcus's life without leaving a trace of evidence behind. The fire quickly grew out of control. It wasn't long before the whole house was engulfed in flames. The bright orange light illuminated the night sky, casting a harsh glow over the neighborhood. It was impossible to ignore the fire now. The crackling sound of burning wood filled the air, a harsh reminder of what had just happened. But as the fire raged, something the officers hadn't planned for began to happen. The lights in the surrounding houses started to flick on as neighbors woke up to the sound of sirens and the sight of the fire in the distance. Panic spread through the community. People rushed outside, some calling the fire department, others standing in shock, watching as the flames devoured the house. The officers, still hidden in the shadows, knew they had to leave quickly. They didn't stay to watch any longer, fearing that someone might connect them to the crime. They had done their part, and now they wanted to disappear into the night before anyone could figure out what had really happened. By the time the fire trucks arrived, Marcus's house was nothing more than a pile of burning ruins. The firefighters did what they could to control the blaze, but it was clear that the house was already lost. It would take hours for the fire to be fully extinguished, and by then, all that would be left would be the charred remains of what had once been Marcus's home. When the fire was finally under control, the reality of the damage became clear. Marcus's house, his belongings, and the life he had built were gone. Little did he know, the worst was yet to come. The officers thought they had succeeded, but they had underestimated one thing. Marcus was no ordinary man, and they would soon find out that their actions would have consequences they never expected. The morning after the fire, the small town was buzzing with the news. Marcus's house had burned to the ground, leaving behind nothing but ashes. Neighbors gathered in groups, talking in hushed tones about the terrible tragedy. They couldn't believe it. Marcus, the quiet man who had always been friendly and helpful, had lost everything in the fire. Some people even wondered if it was an accident, but no one could be sure. The flames had been so fierce and fast, it seemed strange to think it could be anything but a deliberate act. Marcus had not been home when the fire broke out. He was still away on his FBI assignment, working on a case in another city. But when he received the call about his house, everything changed. His mind raced as he processed the news. The fire had destroyed everything he had worked so hard for. The home that had been his sanctuary, where he could relax after difficult days, was now gone. It was hard for him to believe. Still, Marcus remained calm. He had learned to stay composed in tough situations. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't just a random accident. Something didn't add up. He had been careful about keeping his life private. No one knew the full details of his job with the FBI, and he trusted that his work was protected. But now, with his home burned to the ground, it seemed like someone had targeted him. When Marcus arrived back in town, he went straight to the site of the fire. It was still smoldering, the ruins of his house barely recognizable. He walked around, taking in the devastation, trying to understand who would want to do this to him. As he stood there, the weight of the situation hit him. Whoever did this was trying to send a message, but what message was it? Soon, law enforcement arrived to investigate the fire. The local police were doing their best to figure out what had happened, but there were too many questions and not enough answers. As the fire department and investigators worked, Marcus stayed nearby, trying to piece together the mystery. It wasn't long before the truth started to come to light. The investigators found evidence that made them believe the fire wasn't an accident. There were signs that the blaze had been set intentionally. The way the fire started, the materials used, and the patterns of the flames all pointed to arson. This discovery raised even more suspicion, and the authorities began to take the situation seriously. What no one expected, however, was the shocking twist that would come next. As the investigation unfolded, the local police began to piece together the facts. They had already heard rumors about Marcus's work, but no one knew the full story. Slowly, they uncovered the truth. Marcus wasn't just any man. He was an FBI agent, a law enforcement officer with the federal government. At first, it was hard for some to believe. They had all seen Marcus around town, thinking he was just another hardworking man with a simple life. But the revelation that he was an FBI agent left them speechless. No one had ever guessed it. To many, Marcus had always seemed so humble and unassuming. He had never flaunted his position, and it was only now, in the face of this terrible tragedy, that his true role was revealed. This new information spread quickly throughout the town. The local police and the FBI were now connected by this revelation, and soon, the full scale of what had happened began to unfold. Marcus had been targeted by someone who had no idea who he truly was. The fire was not just a random act of violence. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy the life of someone who was working to uphold justice. For Marcus, it was both a shock and a realization. He now understood that his work with the FBI had made him a target. But even as the truth came out, he knew one thing for sure. The people who had set this fire had no idea who they were really dealing with. He was no ordinary man, and they were about to find out just how far he would go to get justice. As the days passed following the shocking discovery that Marcus was an FBI agent, the town was thrown into chaos. People were talking, whispering about what had happened, and trying to piece together the mystery of the fire that had destroyed Marcus's house. But as the investigation deepened, a troubling thought began to cross the minds of those looking into the case. What if this wasn't just a random act of violence? What if someone had deliberately targeted Marcus because of who he was? The local police had started to investigate, but they were clearly struggling. Some of the officers were still unsure of how to handle the situation. After all, this wasn't just a fire. It was something much more serious. And then there was the bigger question. who was responsible for burning down Marcus's house. At first, no one could make a connection, but as the investigation progressed, certain patterns began to emerge. The officers who had been secretly watching Marcus, Detective Carter and his team, knew they had to cover their tracks. They had never expected the investigation to get this far, and now they were worried that their actions would be exposed. They knew they had set the fire, but they didn't think anyone would connect them to it. After all, they had been careful, or so they thought. Detective Carter, the leader of the group, was a man who believed in controlling the situation. He had always been able to manipulate people, to make things go his way. Now he was determined to do the same with the fire investigation. He started to spread the idea that the fire had been an accident, a simple mishap that could happen to anyone. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He and his team had set that fire with clear intent. But there was a problem. The more the investigators looked into the case, the more evidence they uncovered that pointed to arson. The way the fire had started, the materials that had been used, and the patterns of the flames all suggested that someone had deliberately set the fire. The investigators also began to notice inconsistencies in the story that had been told by the local police officers. They knew something wasn't adding up. As Detective Carter continued his efforts to cover up the truth, Marcus's case was now being taken seriously by the FBI. Word had spread about the fire, and higher-ups in the FBI were determined to get to the bottom of it. They sent their own team to join the investigation. This meant that the local police could no longer hide behind their lies. The FBI was now involved, and they would not stop until the truth was revealed. Detective Carter tried to keep control of the situation, but it was clear that the walls were closing in. His team had been sloppy, and the evidence was starting to pile up against them. The FBI's investigation was thorough, and soon they discovered surveillance footage from nearby buildings that showed the local officers near Marcus's house on the night of the fire. It was hard to deny the truth when it was staring them in the face. As the investigation continued to unfold, Detective Carter's team began to panic. They realized that the fire they had set to destroy Marcus's life was now leading directly back to them. The very people they had tried to deceive were closing in on the truth, and soon they would have no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. Marcus, meanwhile, was quietly watching everything unfold. He had known all along that someone had been behind the fire, but now he saw just how far the people responsible would go to cover up their lies. The truth was starting to surface, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before justice would catch up with the officers who had tried to destroy him. The investigation into the fire at Marcus's house had reached a crucial point. As the days passed, the local police tried their best to keep the truth hidden. But the deeper the FBI dug, the more evidence came to light. Detective Carter, who had once believed they could cover their tracks, was now starting to feel the pressure. The walls were closing in, and it seemed like the lies they had built around the fire were starting to crumble. Marcus, though shaken by the destruction of his home, knew that the truth would eventually come to light. He had seen the way people tried to cover up their mistakes in the past, but he also knew that lies always had a way of unraveling. It was only a matter of time before someone, whether it was an investigator or a witness, would piece everything together. As the investigation progressed, the FBI uncovered some troubling facts. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed police vehicles near Marcus's neighborhood on the night of the fire. The footage was clear, and it was hard to deny that the officers who had been watching Marcus were the same ones present near the scene of the arson. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The footage, along with the accounts of local witnesses, made it clear that someone in the police force was involved. The FBI investigators also began to piece together other pieces of evidence. They found traces of the materials used to start the fire, materials that had been obtained under suspicious circumstances. There was also the fact that the fire had started in several locations at once, suggesting it was planned and executed with careful thought. All of these clues pointed to one undeniable fact. The fire had been set deliberately, and it had been set by someone with a clear motive. Detective Carter's attempts to manipulate the investigation were no longer working. The evidence was stacking up against him, and the pressure was mounting. He tried to deflect attention away from his team, suggesting that the fire could have been the result of a random act, but the more the FBI uncovered, the more it became clear that there was no way this could be an accident. Someone had planned it, and it wasn't a mystery anymore. As the investigation continued to unfold, Marcus kept his focus. He had been through difficult situations before, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about solving the case. It was about protecting his own life, and the life he had worked so hard to build. He watched as the authorities began to take action, gathering the pieces of the puzzle that would lead to the truth. Then came the breakthrough. The FBI found a series of phone records that linked Detective Carter and his team to conversations on the night of the fire. They had made calls that confirmed they were in the area when the fire started. This was the final piece of evidence that exposed their involvement. There was no longer any doubt that these officers had played a direct role in the attack on Marcus's life. The truth was out, and there was no way for the officers to hide from it now. Marcus knew that the wheels of justice were starting to turn, and the people who had tried to destroy him would soon be held accountable for their actions. It was a moment of quiet satisfaction for Marcus, but he also understood that this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of a long road toward justice. As the investigation continued, the truth became undeniable. Detective Carter and his team could no longer hide from their actions. The evidence had mounted up, piece by piece, until it was impossible for them to deny their involvement in the destruction of Marcus's home. They had thought they could get away with it. They had underestimated the power of justice, the persistence of the FBI, and the determination of Marcus. The officers were slowly realizing that their lies were unraveling, and they began to panic. Detective Carter, the leader of the group, had always been confident in his ability to control situations, but now he found himself helpless. The more the FBI investigated, the clearer it became that they were guilty. Their every move had been tracked, and every mistake had been uncovered. The walls were closing in around them. It wasn't long before the FBI moved in. The officers who had taken part in the fire were arrested one by one. The news spread quickly throughout the town, and people were shocked to learn that members of the local police force had been involved in such a terrible act. Marcus, too, had heard the news. While he felt a sense of relief that the truth had come out, he also knew that the consequences were just beginning. These officers had used their power to destroy a man's life, and now they would have to pay the price for their actions. The arrest of Detective Carter and his team was just the beginning. The officers were charged with multiple crimes, including arson, conspiracy, and violation of civil rights. These charges weren't taken lightly, and soon they were facing the full weight of the law. As the case went to trial, the community watched in disbelief as their once trusted officers were exposed for the criminals they truly were. The trust that had once existed between the police and the community was shattered. People could hardly believe that the very officers who were supposed to protect them had been the ones to bring destruction. For Marcus, the truth brought a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, he felt justice was being served. The officers who had targeted him would now face the consequences of their actions. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. It was hard to believe that the very people who were meant to uphold the law could be capable of such harm. The events had shaken his faith in the system, but they had also made him more determined than ever to continue his work in law enforcement. As the trial moved forward, more evidence came to light. The officers' actions had been carefully planned, and they had been willing to do anything to tear Marcus down. But now, they were facing the consequences of their decisions. They had tried to destroy a man who stood for justice, but in the end, it was their own actions that would bring about their downfall. The trial was a long and painful process, but it was also a victory for Marcus. It wasn't just about punishing the officers for their crime. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. Marcus knew that the journey wasn't over, but the fact that the truth had come out gave him hope. The officers had tried to break him, But instead, they had only strengthened his resolve. After what felt like an endless journey, the trial finally came to an end. Detective Carter and his team were found guilty of arson, conspiracy, and violating Marcus's civil rights. The courtroom was filled with tension as the verdict was read. Marcus, sitting in the front row, felt a sense of calm wash over him. The officers who had tried to destroy his life were now being held accountable for their actions. It was a bittersweet victory, one that came at a great cost, but it was justice. As the guilty officers were led away in handcuffs, Marcus stood up, a quiet strength in his eyes. He had been through so much: the fire, the loss of his home, and the deep betrayal, but he had never wavered. His belief in doing what was right had carried him through the darkest moments. Now, as the trial concluded, he felt a sense of relief. The truth had been revealed, and the people who had hurt him would face the consequences of their actions. The community was left in shock, trying to come to terms with the fact that their trusted police officers had been involved in such a crime. Many people were ashamed, but others were proud of the way Marcus had handled the situation. His courage in the face of such adversity had inspired them. He had shown them that even when the system failed, one person's determination could make a difference. Marcus became a symbol of resilience and justice, a man who had faced incredible odds and come out stronger. Despite the pain and loss he had experienced, Marcus knew that his journey was far from over. His work with the FBI had always been about serving others, and even though his personal life had been disrupted, his dedication to the job remained unchanged. He had seen firsthand the effects of corruption and betrayal, but he had also witnessed the power of truth and the importance of standing up for what is right. In the weeks that followed the trial, Marcus slowly began to rebuild his life. The FBI helped him find a new home, and though it was difficult to start over, he felt hopeful. The scars of the past would never fully disappear, but he was ready to move forward. He knew that the path ahead would not always be easy, but he was no stranger to challenges. In fact, he had faced some of the toughest ones and come out stronger every time. Marcus's return to his work at the FBI was met with respect and admiration. His colleagues were proud of him for his strength and his unwavering commitment to justice. They knew that the journey he had been through had changed him, but they also knew it had only made him more determined. Marcus had proven that no matter the obstacles in life, justice could still prevail. As for the officers who had tried to destroy him, they now faced the consequences of their actions. Their lives were forever changed, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The fire they had set to destroy Marcus had, in the end, only exposed their own corruption and greed. The story of Marcus, the quiet black man who had once been a simple neighbor, became a powerful reminder to everyone that the truth will always come to light. It didn't matter who you were or what you stood for, the law would find a way to hold you accountable. Marcus's heroism, his courage in the face of betrayal, had not only protected his own life, but it had also helped to heal the trust that had been broken in the community. Justice had been served, and Marcus was once again able to find peace, knowing that he had done what was right.